three main takeaways from your book, I think they would be stop faking orgasms, do what you want, and be vulnerable. Hello and welcome to It's Hardback Out Here in conversation with the amazing Tracy Clark-Flory. Would you like to introduce yourself, Tracy?
Sure. I'm Tracy. I'm a journalist. I've worked as a reporter for over 15 years now. I'm also the author of Want Me, A Sex Writer's Journey into the Heart of Desire, which came out 2 years ago now, I think. It is a sexual coming of age story. It's about coming of age as a woman in this world of ours. Especially for me, wedged between these sort of competing messages around feminism and sort of sexualized pop culture. And I live in the San Francisco Bay Area.
So thank you so much for joining us. And we are today going to be talking about Want Me, which is Tracy's amazing memoir. So the first question I want to kick off with is, what was the hardest part about writing this book? Because it is a very kind of vulnerable, like nothing hidden kind of book. Did you find that difficult, or had you kind of already come to kind of grips with that growing up as a sex writer?
I would say the hardest part of writing the book was publishing it, not writing it, because writing it, I was able to really harbor this delusion that it was just me and the page. And like, of course I knew people were going to read it, but I just didn't think about that. So I just thought about telling the truth. And so it was very no holds barred. And I think when it really hit me, like what it meant for it to go out into the world, it was when I was recording the audiobook. And I was like sitting in this recording studio with the sound engineer and the producer, which was a very intimate experience of like, for the very first time reading my book out loud to anyone. And they're like hanging on my every word. And, obviously the book is very emotional and personal, and there are uncomfortable moments. And it was really like, oh, this is going out into the world. And so I think the hardest part was reconciling this like freedom on the page and then the reality of what it means to be free in the world in that way, to like hand those pages over and to other people, to strangers. But yeah, the writing itself was difficult in its own way, of course, very challenging. But I think that was the part that really, it felt difficult because the writing itself felt very free.
That's really interesting that you say that, because what's the one thing that I loved about the book is how you kind of describe, say, sex as almost like it was a form of self-harm, sort of in your younger years, and how you kind of how you wrote about that without judging yourself. Like, I think it's so easy to look back on those times and kind of chastise yourself, like, I wish I knew this, I shouldn't have done this. But I think you treated it with a lot of kindness, which I think was like quite freeing to read at the same time, because it's like those are your years to kind of experiment and make mistakes and figure it all out. So what's one thing that you wish you knew in your 20s? Now, I know in the book you kind of said that she was doing the best with what she knew at the time, but if you could go back to her and say one specific thing, what would you say?
I mean, I think it's just the most cliche thing that I think I've heard other people say in response to similar questions, which is, it's going to be okay. Which, if I tried to say that to my younger self, I would have been like, okay, sure. Thanks a lot. That doesn't help me right now, but I think, and that is the thing. I think that's what's so challenging about trying to, someone who has kind of, sailed through the rocky waters of their 20s and reached the other side and, are looking back and either thinking of their younger selves or trying to give advice to younger people. It's so easy to give advice from that sort of safe perch. And when you're going through it, it feels so different. And so I guess what I would wish for is something that's kind of impossible, which is the ability to give my younger self that belief that everything would be okay. And I don't know that it's possible. I wish that there was some like nugget of truth that could just be so easily passed down. But I think, and maybe that is the thing. It's that you have to go on your journey, and you have to experience this for yourself. Like, this is not something that anyone else can do for you. I can't, hand you that nugget of wisdom and then you don't have to go through it. You have to go through it no matter what.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And as we were saying on the call, it's hard back out here. So I think that is the thing. You have to just kind of feel it yourself, and every person's journey will be sort of different. And obviously, part of the book is discovering what you actually enjoyed, because a lot of it, especially in your younger years, was kind of desiring to be desired and wanting what you thought men wanted. And how did you kind of overcome that as you grew older? Like, was there kind of a light bulb moment where you thought, I just want what men want? How did you kind of come over that?
Yeah, it was a very gradual process. I think that one of the most powerful things was, as a journalist, I was able to kind of discover all of the ways that I had been misled around men's desires. I think our culture feeds us this very simplistic view of what straight men want. And being a sex journalist for so long and interviewing men themselves, talking to sex researchers, interviewing porn performers, like the whole range of things. There were so many different instances, many of which I write about in the book, which really drove home the point that like all of our so many of our assumptions around sex in general are wrong. So many of our assumptions around what straight men want are wrong and overly simplistic. And I think once you start to come up against those contradictions, especially so repeatedly, it becomes a lot easier to let go of this essentially mirage, that I had been kind of working towards. You see the futility in pursuing it. And so that was part of, I think, being able to abandon it. And then I also think it was partly a factor of like, I'd spent so much of my 20s trying to cater to this idea of men's desire. And I got to a point where I was tired of it, where I was actually, I feel like I could put my own pleasure and desire on hold for only so long. And so it sort of reached that point where there was the absurdity of like pursuing this mirage on the one hand, and then on the other hand, just being sick of it, just being so sick of it and needing to change.
I think there's a lot about faking orgasms in the book, and it's really interesting because I think now one of my questions later on will be how you think sex and sex education has changed since you were growing up. And I think is it called femme baiting, like men who kind of pose as feminists and then kind of aren't the worst ones, because you think, oh
Yeah.
yes. And speaking from my own experiences, I've had times where I thought, oh, he gets it, like he's into female pleasure, blah blah, and then it was non-existent. And yeah, that's something which is like quite interesting, and yeah, especially with like the kind of expectation versus reality of the porn stars. Like I remember you talking about sleeping with a porn star and how that was kind of not what you expected it to be at all, and watching it and going through it is a very different experience. So can we talk a little bit more about that, like the expectation versus reality of the porn actors and the porn sets?
Yeah. I mean, I think like, growing up on porn, starting to watch porn when I was probably, I don't know, 13, in the very early days of the internet, I interpreted it pretty literally. Like I thought, this is what men want. Like this is the ultimate fantasy. Therefore, this is what men want in the bedroom, as opposed to, this is a fantasy. This is entertainment. This isn't a reflection of what necessarily what your partners are going to want in the bedroom, it's not necessarily a reflection of what you want in the bedroom, even if it's stuff that you enjoy watching. And so, you know, writing about the porn industry for a very long time, that was like one of the most important things that I learned, which was that, you know, like fantasy can exist over here. It's not necessarily something that you want to make real or even can make real in your own life. And that there's something really beautiful about that, that like the sphere of fantasy can be like this wonderful place of exploration and self-discovery, and intimacy with other people. You know, it can be offer, you know, opportunities for catharsis and escape and so many different things. And that like that is beautiful in itself. It doesn't need to be something that you necessarily try to realize in, you know, your partnered sex life. And, you know, there's a scene in the book where I am reporting on a porn set, and I actually am chatting with a performer who I grew up watching. So he was one of the people who'd helped kind of shape my idea of what sex should look like. And he was talking about how, he doesn't like having sex like that in his real life, that this is entertainment. And, you know, that becomes so clear when you're like, as a reporter on a porn set, watching like the director call cut and watching those moments in between scenes where like the lube is brought out. You know, typically, often in mainstream porn, you're not seeing those moments of like, ooh, I need a little lube, this is a little uncomfortable, or can we like switch positions, you know, which are part of sex as it happens in real life. But when you're producing a fantasy, like the seamless fantasy for people to consume, oftentimes that's doesn't show up in the final cut. And so that became very clear to me that like much like Hollywood, you know, mainstream films are not a reflection of what life is really like. Like the typical, I often hear people say, you know, you don't watch Fast and the Furious to learn how to drive, right? And so similarly with porn, like, you know, that's not the point. It's not supposed to be sex education mostly. It's supposed to be entertainment. So it's unfortunate to me that I had to go through, you know, 15 years of reporting on sex in order to get those lessons, because I think there's just not enough sort of conversation and education around that, that these should be things that are more readily discoverable.
And do you think that porn is still conflated with sex education, or do you think that we've kind of gotten more open about that topic now?
I think we're definitely much more open in terms of talking about porn, but I also think that oftentimes the way that we talk about porn is very simplistic, and it's often from this perspective of critiquing porn and critiquing its influence in a way that I think is often like very blind to like the multitude of influences in our culture that like mainstream influences. You know, I think that like in general, there's like young people could benefit from critical analysis of all sort of forms of pop culture. But yeah, I think it's certainly talked about more than it was when I was a younger person. But I don't know like how much like the level of conversation has actually improved. I think there's like still a great deal of sort of shame around it. Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting point, because thinking to kind of conversations that I might have had with friends, it'd be, oh, he was aggressive. And it's like, well, he clearly watched porn. But then it's like, well, okay, but he might have been taught aggression in areas of like growing up, like, you know, there's it's everywhere. It's not just in porn, it's the culture that helps to create it, if that makes sense.
If only it were, yes, totally. If only it were as simple as like pointing to one entertainment medium and being like, well, that's the problem. And it's like, no, the problem is the culture that we live in, like the aggression. If you want to talk about sexual aggression or aggression towards women more generally, like it is so deeply baked in the culture and it shows up literally everywhere. So, you know, and yes, of course, too, it also shows up in porn. But yeah, I think, you know, it's a little short-sighted to just focus on one.
Yeah, definitely. And something that I liked in the book was the like the evolution from sort of young Tracy to older Tracy when she goes to see the Magic Mike show and she's like it, and then you repeat the phrase I didn't like it, and it just kind of made me sad for like the younger version of Tracy that like was clearly uncomfortable in situations but didn't have that sort of mental clarity of like I didn't like that. um
Mhm.
what do you think helped you sort of come to that conclusion? Was it kind of getting older? Was it knowing your body more? Or do you think that perhaps you were kind of less assertive in your desires younger?
Mhm. I mean, it's a whole host of things, but I would say the main thing was in my younger sex life, I was not very vulnerable. And I think when you're not sort of like vulnerable and in tune with what you're experiencing, what's going on in your body, your emotions, um, it's not as easy to come to that I don't like this. Like you don't even necessarily know that you don't like it. Like if you're so performative, focused on what your partner wants or what you think that your partner wants, on appearing a certain way, if you're sort of like taking the spectator view of what everything that's happening, you're not actually in your body, then it's a lot harder to say or even realize I don't like this. And so I think it was really for me, getting to a place in a relationship where I felt safe and had a great deal of, communication and honesty and vulnerability and trust, that I was able to like really start tapping into what I liked, what I didn't like, and to have that vulnerability in sex. And it was only after reaching that point of vulnerability that I was able to actually recognize those things, to be able to say, no, actually, I don't like this. This isn't what I want.
I really like how you describe that because you kind of think like a lot of the sex that you had like when you were younger was quite aggressive and that kind of thing, and you think that that is vulnerable, and it is physically vulnerable in many ways, kind of like almost like contortionist positions and all, kind of subjecting yourself to being slapped and things like that. But it's interesting how that is kind of almost removed from emotional vulnerability, like, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that was a quite an interesting discussion point that came up for me when I was reading the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were certainly phases in my life where I really approached it as like sex as battle. Like, and I think that makes honestly total sense to me now looking back, that as a young woman, I felt like dating and sex in my 20s was a battlefield, and that I like had to go in heavily armored. And I really sort of took on this attitude of like, I can handle it, I can take it, like, just watch me.
Yeah.
And there's no vulnerability there. The whole point is about like being strong and powerful and in control. And which was a performance. Like that's, and so yeah, the armor was on majorly.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting that at one point there was the power dynamics kind of came out. But then someone said to you like you're the one in control, even though you're being the submissive one. And again, I think
Mm-hmm.
it's so interesting in terms of sort of the power dynamics of it all. So my next question is, why did you decide to become a sex writer? Like what made you think I really want to write about my experiences and be vulnerable doing that growing up?
I don't think it was ever like really a conscious decision that like I think it was just there was this drive in me, like this need to write about sex and to write about it very honestly. And I, I think initially I assumed that this was because like I grew up with a couple of sex positive hippies in Berkeley, California, and that like, that I sort of had the a sense of permission, that it would be like I wouldn't be disowned by my family for writing about sex. But I think I've come to realize that there are more complicated reasons for why I pursued this, and one of those is that my mom, 20 years before I was born, when she was 18 years old, she got pregnant and she was sent away to a home for unwed mothers, which was a very common practice in that time, in these pre-Roe era, in 1965. And they're essentially institutions of shame. They're institutions that were designed to hide women away who had gotten pregnant out of wedlock and to make it seem like it had never happened, to place their babies for adoption. And so my mom was traumatized by that, of course. And that was, I think that I understood what had happened to my mom in her sort of being silenced and shamed around her sexuality. And so while I didn't have like a conscious sense that that was what was going on for me, I think that I really felt this desperate need to tell the truth about sex, like that it was that telling the truth about sex felt like survival to me in some essential way, because I understood what could happen to a woman like my mom who had sort of been silenced around it. And so I kind of like went out there like, I will not be silenced. I'm going to tell it all. So I think that was a big piece of this, just like drive to do this thing that is pretty uncomfortable in our culture. Like it's not, it's dangerous. It's not safe. It's risky to like put these things out there, but it felt essential to me.
Yeah, I think there's a phrase in the book where you say that your mum was scorned with a scarlet letter and you used that scarlet letter to write. And yeah, the way that you spoke up your mum was obviously very, very poignant, but really great to read. And I think it's really great that you were brought up by sort of such sex positive parents, because you can kind of see the culture of shame that exists when people aren't. But I have to say my heart did break a little bit for younger Tracy as well when discovering your dad's porn, because you'd been told like, oh, you don't need to be like that, but in a way that's internalized misogyny in itself, like the idea that, oh, I don't need to be like other girls, which is something that I've learned like as I've grown up, like that kind of, oh, I'm different is just as
right
realistic as
yes
being those girls, and you get judged either way, like that.
absolutely
Yeah.
yeah
It must have been quite hard kind of discovering your dad's porn after he kind of preached to you that you don't need to be like that.
right
What was that like, having him read your piece on that? Like, what was that discussion like with your dad?
yeah um Yeah, I mean, it's really funny. He discovered like early pages that I'd printed out of the book. So even before it published, he'd like he was just coming over to babysit my son, and I left the house and came back, and he'd like found these pages I'd left around that he thought I'd like left out for him to read, which I had not. And it was like the section around discovering his porn. And I felt embarrassed. Obviously, I was going to talk with him about it eventually, but I felt embarrassed. But he was very sort of cool about it. Like, he was not embarrassed at all. So it was kind of like this ripping off the Band-Aid of like, having the talk, and but he had no sort of shame around it and totally gave me permission to write honestly about it. So
I
it was awkward but good.
And I think that is what it is really. It's awkward but good, like these kind of discussions. And I think obviously when we discuss sex, like it does need to be intersectional. And I think that was what you did really well in the book, was pointing out times where you hadn't realized your own privilege. What's the biggest realization of your privilege when you were writing this book? Was there one thing that kind of made you think, oh, I was acting like that because of this, or oh, I didn't realize this? Like there was the comment of the straight ladies in the gay club,
Yeah.
or sort of how the experience of a white woman is obviously different to a woman of color. Was there a specific moment where you were like, I acted like that because of privilege?
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't a specific moment. I think there was just like growing realization over the years. It's just that in general, this idea of like playing at being bad, whether it was like, say going to a strip club, for example, like I think that was like the strongest example of that, of like, you know, this idea of sort of going wild, of having a wild night out with friends and going to a strip club and sitting at the stage and, you know, with dollar bills, and this idea of like, of being bad in this very, very sort of contained way. And realizing, one, the privilege of being a white woman who is given the assumption of goodness to start, like that you are placed on a pedestal from which you can fall, as opposed to being a Black woman who is never given that assumption of goodness, quite the opposite. And so the privilege of playing with notions of being bad, and then the privilege of being a non-sex worker in a sex working space, and playing at being bad while these women are working, doing their jobs, and who are also carrying the, you know, sort of shame of being sex workers and being bad women in a way that is, you know, not played at all, you know, and that there isn't, you know, they don't have the choice of sort of like, you know, just walking out of the strip club and saying like, oh, well, that was a fun, wild night out. So there are so many different like layers of privilege, even in just like that one example of like having a wild night out at a strip club. And I was completely oblivious to that at the time. And it was really only in my later 20s that I started to reflect on that. And that showed up at so many different points in my life, for sure.
And I also really liked how you transitioned to also, like, you're a mum now, and you kind of say, where's that wild, sexy Tracy gone? And you kind of said, well, like, she's still there, but she's there in like a kind of in a different way. And I think the main thing that's really good in the book that you discuss is like the idea that women are free in this culture. It's like, yeah, you can, you know, sleep with who you want, blah, blah, blah. But we're not really free. Like, we're kind of, as you say, we're still wanting to be desired, but in the male gaze and all these kind of things. What do you think that we can do to try and free ourselves, if anything?
Mm. I mean, I guess I would say that sexual empowerment is not an individual task, that it's like a collective task. And so I think our our culture is so focused on self-improvement and self-help, and which really convinces us that we are the problem, as opposed to all of the systemic hurdles that are the actual problem. And so I really feel like recognizing like our collective struggle and collective circumstances is most important, that's true empowerment, and that, you know, without that, you can only make these sort of marginal, like little bits of progress in terms of like, oh, you can, as I did, you can, you know, get in touch with your body and your own desires and your pleasure. And those are all really valid and important things to explore. But I think end up being actually very empty without that other component of sort of, you know, broader consciousness of shared struggle and oppression.
And also, I suppose, I guess what we're kind of still shackled by is like the patriarchy and the kind of male gaze, even for like gay women and stuff. That's still kind of, so much of it is within the male gaze, like the reactions to it, and, you know, like lesbians just being sexualized on the street just because they're lesbians, all this kind of thing. And it's kind of shouldn't really be for us to emancipate ourselves, but
yeah
that's kind of a wider discussion. So how do you think attitudes towards sex and sex education have changed since you wrote the book, even, and since growing up? Obviously, you know, the internet is a very vast source of sex information, but I think it's kind of even more so now. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, at least like speaking to the United States, like it depends so much on where you live, unfortunately. And so you could have a vastly different experience. My experience, even growing up in the Bay Area, very, progressive area, sex education was not so great for me. And this was like back in like the, late 90s, 2000s. You know, how much progress have we seen since then? I think I've seen that there's been a lot of in some areas, developments around porn literacy programs that essentially attempt to talk with kids about what porn is, to understand how it's made, that sort of thing, which ostensibly is really wonderful, and it's kind of exactly what I wish that I'd had when I was coming of age. But in reality, like some of the examples that I've seen of how it's executed is actually very shaming to sex workers and that sort of thing. So I feel skeptical about it. I think, it all depends on sort of the execution. So yeah, it's like, I think for some young people, they're getting conversations about porn that are really essential, and other young people are getting conversations about porn that are very shaming. And I think the unfortunate thing is that it's just so variable that like there's no sort of standard that I have faith in right now in the country in terms of like public education around sex. But yeah, the internet has opened up a lot of different avenues, both good and bad, in terms of learning about sex. And it's unfortunate that young people just sort of have to chart that path on their own, that like there isn't a more sort of trustworthy guide out there.
And I think there is kind of an overt sexualization from perhaps a younger age. Obviously, like I think social media has added to the individualist culture that we were speaking about earlier. So that's something which I think, even growing up, like my sister's 2 years younger than me, but even having those 2 years on me, like how much Instagram and Snapchat kind of really defined like how she grew up and what she wore. And it was like, what can I post on Instagram? Like it was kind of that as well.
Yeah.
Which I think is quite interesting. And also something else which is quite scary is obviously the AI development. And I watched a documentary the other day on deep faking. And that's a whole new dimension of just
Yeah.
And I guess there'll be new books kind of written on that in years to come.
I'm sure.
And I think you write about kind of the sex dolls at the end of the book. So that was quite an interesting passage. Like, could we talk a little bit more about that? The kind of like the doll to woman trajectory that you kind of
Yeah, so I visited the Real Doll Factory and for a story I was doing, and I got to walk through and like see all sorts of wild things. Like they had like a sort of display of like all the different types of nipples that they put on the dolls that customers could choose from, or like all the different hair, all the different eyelashes, all the different eyeballs, all the different breasts, shapes, everything. Like, and it was just so wild to see like this women sort of atomized in this way, where it's just like down to like just the nitty gritty of like just to be focused on nipples in that way of like the size, the shape, the texture, the color. And part of what I realized was like they have this range of customization because in part people have very specific particular wants. And so it was kind of funny to go into this doll factory that was selling a sort of fantasy, and that I assumed would be this very like sort of prepackaged idea. And it is in many ways, but like it was actually very interesting to see the variation in like pubic hair preferences. Like there are people who want this, that, or the other thing. And so it was like, sort of, there was good and bad in it. It was like realizing the wild variability and of people's desires. And then it was also this, sort of reckoning with the this just objectification of the female form. And I think that was one of those moments like of realizing like the futility of this like search to become what men want, like the attempts at performing it, like when you're in a literal sex doll factory.
Yeah, literal objects.
Literal objects, and like, no, I don't want to turn myself into a literal object. Like, you're like I think there's the absurdity of it was highlighted so starkly in that kind of setting. I think like that happens when you go to these like farthest extremes. It really highlights, the absurdity of it all.
There was the like porn wrestling match that you went to watch,
Yeah.
and commented again, like just the absurdity of it and the fact that
Yeah.
so far, like it's just kind of so different. And I think one of my questions is going to be, obviously you've been to like porn wrestling like matches, sex dolls, all these kinds of things. Is there one specific person you spoke to or article that you wrote, which, I mean, they've all probably had a lasting impact on you, but is there one that really kind of made you change the way that you think, or was something that you talk about specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main one is the moment that opens the book, which I mentioned earlier, of being on a porn set and talking with this porn performer who I had come of age watching, who'd really informed some of my ideas about sex. And to hear him talking about girls these days who, essentially reenact what they see in porn, and how much that's not the kind of sex that he likes to have in his real life. And at that point, I was pretty far along in my journey, and I'd had a lot of these realizations along the way of talking to, sex researchers and living my own life and everything. And so, in a way, it wasn't a shock to me in that moment to hear this. It was like something that I intellectually understood, but there was something so powerful about standing there with this man that I'd watched, as a teenager coming of age, and then to be standing there with him as a reporter and a 20-something woman, and to hear him say that, it was like I was able to really start to believe it in a way like that was beyond just my intellectual understanding of porn as performance and the realm of fantasy and all of that. So that was really, it was this moment that felt like really coming full circle, of like returning to that younger girl who had grown up with this idea of what men expected of me. And then to have the curtain pulled back in this like such a dramatic way. That one, I mean, there's so many moments along the way, but that was one of the most memorable that will always stick with me.
It's really interesting because this month we've been covering the theme of sex, and there's another book written by Rachel Thompson called Rough, and it's all about how sexual violence has become normalized. And she speaks to a couple, and he chokes her all the time, and then they sit down to interview, and they realize that neither of them actually asked each other whether they wanted it or enjoyed it. And they both said, "Oh, I thought that's what you wanted to do." And then I thought that's what you wanted to do. And you just think it's crazy that is like, it's taken as the blueprint. And then you're like, well, if not even the men who perform it want it, then it does kind of seem like a losing battle. And it's interesting when I think about kind of men written by women, like that kind of dynamic. And quite often it's more feminine men. Like, I don't know what you think about that, but it's kind of like the Harry Styles prototype. And yeah, it's kind of so far removed from that kind of like sexual aggression that we've, obviously that's not speaking for all women. But when I hear of like, oh, he's written by a woman, I think of someone who's kind of more in touch with their femininity almost. And I think quite masculine in many ways. Like I think Chris kind of portrays that. He's he's in touch with his femininity, which is like makes him really attractive in the book. So yeah, I think that's just so interesting how you can't win.
Oh, totally. I mean, yeah. And I write about this too in the book of like, I had spent all this time trying to sort of be what men wanted. And then I ended up with a man who had in many ways tried to be what women wanted. And both of us had kind of come up against the how false our notions of what people wanted was. And so it was like there was this kind of, you know, it was kind of poetic, like our coming together after like this like, you know, misguided search on both of our parts. And there is so much of miscommunication around sex and so much of assuming that this is what your partner wants, and like that kind of mutual performance where that's just lacking vulnerability and lacking authenticity, and we're just like pulling from the, you know, dominant heterosexual scripts around sex and just like kind of going through the motions of what we think is expected and wanted. And there's so many missed opportunities in that, you know, so many missed opportunities for pleasure and connection and intimacy when we're just performing this idea instead of actually communicating with our partners about what they want.
Yeah, and it just makes it such an impersonal act. Like at the end of the day, it's you have to communicate between like the two of you specifically, or however many people. Like otherwise, it's going to feel impersonal because you're basing it off what you think other people want, and even then, it's really generalized anyway. Uh,
Yeah.
so my final question is, what books have you read that have inspired you? What writers have you read that inspires you? Or if you could give your 20-something-year-old self one book to read, or like a podcast or anything like that, what would it be?
I mean, gosh, I would have so many different answers for those different questions. Like, I think I basically wrote the book that I wish I'd had when I was in my 20s, because I was so frustrated in that era, just feeling like there was no one who was really speaking to me. And so, I mean, it's kind of a cheat to say my own book, but that is true in terms of like what inspires me. I mean, there's so many books that have been inspiring me lately with this next book that I'm working on. I don't know that any of them would speak necessarily like to that 20s era. But I'll just say like one of the books that I most enjoyed recently was Easy Beauty, is a phenomenal memoir that also you know, weaves in cultural criticism and commentary. I could go on and on. I have my stacks of books around my house that are
I think I was thinking earlier if I could kind of take three main takeaways from your book, I think they would be stop faking orgasms, do what you want, and be vulnerable. And yeah, I do think it has really spoken to me as a 20-something, because yeah, I've just kind of come out of like a series of like long-term relationships, and it's really, really hard trying to figure out what you want when you have this innate desire to do what you think men want, and
Mhm.
really trying to sort of undo that. And I think books like this are really, really vital for that. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It's been great, and everyone read Want Me. It's a great read for every 20-something. Thank you so much.
Thanks.